To put it in terms that are understood by elites in the West, everything aside, all the claims, the ridiculous claims made by the Israelis.
Iran's markets were expected to plummet after an Israeli attack. Instead, something shocking happened, the market surged, and the rial strengthened, sending a clear message that Iran's resilience runs far deeper than the West's stories of weakness. Professor Marandi's insights reveal how Western media, focused on Israel's narrative, missed the real story, one of strength, strategy, and quiet but unshakable defiance. If the truth about Iran's power is so strong that even an assault boosts its confidence, what else has the West been getting wrong?
You see these so-called Iran experts in the West and in the United States who constantly come on television, or they're in think tanks. Many of them were like Iranians who moved to the West, or they have Iranian names and they were born in the West.
Western media has a long history of painting Iran as a nation constantly on the brink of collapse. This narrative seems almost automatic. Any sign of tension, especially involving Israel or the United States, is portrayed as a potential tipping point for Iran's economy and stability. In the days leading up to a recent Israeli attack, we saw exactly this. Headlines claimed Iran's vulnerability as if the whole country was about to buckle under pressure. But what happened when the attack finally took place? Iran's economy didn't tank. In fact, it did the opposite.
As soon as the attack took place, in the morning, the markets went up and the Iranian currency went up.
As soon as news of the assault broke, Iran's stock markets surged and the value of the rial, the country's currency, shot up. That's right, instead of spiraling into chaos, Iran's markets seemed to breathe a little easier. It's as if the attack, rather than crippling the nation, reinforced a collective resilience within the Iranian public and its economy. Think about that. For all the talk of Iran being weak, the real message here is quite the opposite. Iran isn't as fragile as Western media wants us to believe. There's a level of endurance here that the outside world often ignores, perhaps because it doesn't fit the neat narrative of a weaker Middle Eastern power. Professor Marandi's insight into Iran's defense strategy gives us a fascinating look at how calculated and cautious the Iranian government can be, especially under threat. According to Marandi, Iran chose to hold back much of its missile and air defense capability during the recent Israeli attack. This wasn't out of fear or weakness, rather, it was a smart and deliberate decision. By not fully engaging, Iran effectively kept its most advanced defenses off the radar, preventing Israel and the US from observing and analyzing their complete defensive capabilities. Imagine it this way. If Iran had unleashed its full defense potential, Israel and the US would now have valuable intelligence on the range, speed, and precision of Iran's systems. That kind of data could be a goldmine for anyone planning future attacks. Instead, by only using a fraction of its resources, Iran left its adversaries guessing. This restraint shows an understanding of a simple but powerful truth in warfare. Don't reveal your entire hand unless you have to. What's more, Marandi suggests that Iran suspects the attack was as much a test of their systems as it was a direct assault. The US and Israel may have used it as an opportunity to study Iran's reaction and gain insight into their hidden defenses. But because Iran held back, they effectively denied their enemies the opportunity to collect meaningful data. In this way, Iran's cautious response was not just about immediate defense, but about safeguarding its strategic advantages for the future.
Showed damage to a number of military sites in Iran from Israeli strikes over the weekend.
Whether in Ukraine or whether in Russia, you see huge secondary explosions. Now, Parchin, which is right beside Tehran, to the east of Tehran, is a very large area. And it is rather flat. It's hilly, but rather flat. If you don't see the explosion from Tehran because, let's say, because of some hill, you will see the light if there's a secondary explosion. There are none. There were none.
Professor Marandi's observations about the recent attacks on Iran reveal an intriguing story behind the headlines. Despite claims from Israel and the US of successful strikes on critical Iranian infrastructure, there was one glaring absence: any visible evidence of major destruction. Marandi points out that if essential Iranian facilities had truly been hit, there would have been clear secondary explosions and massive damage visible from miles away. Yet, as people across Iran watched and waited, no such devastation appeared. This lack of damage is a strong counterpoint to the reports from Israeli and Western sources. In today's digital age, it's nearly impossible to hide major explosions. Ordinary Iranians with smartphones are everywhere, quick to capture and share what they see. But even with extensive media coverage of the attack, there's no footage showing the large-scale destruction that these successful strikes would imply. The story just doesn't add up. When it comes to Iran's defense, most people picture missile systems or military forces stationed above ground. But what many overlook is the vast network of underground facilities Iran has built over the years, protecting its most strategic assets, from missile defense systems to critical nuclear capabilities. These facilities aren't just simple bunkers, they're fortified layers of protection, carved deep into mountainsides and underground tunnels, built to withstand even the heaviest attacks.
The Iranians took a decision to move all strategic assets, whether civilian or military, deep underground. So the Iranian nuclear program, even if the Israeli regime bombs it, it's not going to face many major damage. Even if the Americans bomb it, they cannot destroy the fundamental infrastructure. It is under a mountain or under mountains.
Professor Marandi explains that this setup wasn't created overnight. For decades, Iran anticipated the need for a strong defense that could endure aggressive assaults, particularly from adversaries like Israel and the US. So they began constructing these hidden strongholds, placing vital assets and operations far out of reach of conventional bombs. It's one thing to hit an above-ground target. It's another entirely to penetrate deep into the earth, where Iran's most valuable resources are protected.
Strategic factories, the important materials and the important machines are all deep underground, and they cannot be touched by these missiles of the Israeli regime. Now they can pretend that they've destroyed Iran's air defense capabilities. Fine.
Even after a recent missile attack, no significant damage was reported to these facilities, reinforcing just how well Iran's infrastructure has been safeguarded. It's almost as though Iran was sending a message. No matter how advanced the weapon, their strategic assets are out of reach. This underground network doesn't just speak to Iran's capability to build secure fortifications, it highlights an intense commitment to sovereignty that can't be easily shaken. The term proxy gets tossed around a lot in the West when talking about Iran's allies, as if groups like Hezbollah are just puppets on a string. But Professor Marandi is quick to point out that this label barely scratches the surface. The idea is to make Iran's allies seem like mere extensions of Iranian control, lacking independence or strength of their own. Yet the reality on the battlefield tells a very different story. Just look at Hezbollah in Lebanon, a group that has stood up to one of the most advanced militaries in the world, Israel, and continues to hold its ground.
But when the war continues and Iran continues to use missiles or uses missiles in larger numbers, then what is their explanation going to be? Of course, they don't really need an explanation because this is how the West works. There is no accountability. And if you go back to the history of Iran, you see these so-called Iran experts in the West.
If Hezbollah were just a proxy, there's no way it could consistently repel Israeli forces with such a success. This isn't just about sporadic skirmishes. Hezbollah has proven time and again that it has the strategic capability, resources, and resilience to resist Israel's efforts to gain territory in Lebanon. And it's not just about holding territory, it's about the message it sends. Hezbollah's success has shown that Iran's allies are more than capable of fighting their own battles, displaying a genuine influence that belies the Western label of proxy. Iran and Hezbollah's unwavering support for Palestine has shifted perspectives across the Middle East, making allies like Hezbollah and Ansar Allah symbols of resilience and defiance. For many in the Arab world, these groups have come to represent the strength and solidarity that Palestinians in Gaza so desperately need. Hezbollah's backing of Palestinian fighters, for example, goes beyond military aid. It's about standing up for a shared cause that resonates deeply with millions of people across the region.
You see these so-called Iran experts in the West and in the United States who constantly come on television, or they're in think tanks. Many of them were like Iranians who moved to the West, or they have Iranian names and they were born in the West. And they're constantly talking about how Iran's on the verge of collapse, and how when Iran developed its missile defense capabilities, they were saying that this is all propaganda. Iran's missiles are no good. Iran doesn't have any good weapons.
Despite what Western and Israeli media often portray, this support has inspired countless individuals who see Iran and Hezbollah as crucial allies in the fight for Palestinian rights. The media in the West and Israel might try to downplay or even ignore this groundswell of admiration, but the reality on the ground tells a different story. Across Arab nations, people recognize and respect this alliance, seeing it as a powerful stance against oppression. Professor Marandi offers a strong critique of the way the West consistently underestimates Iran, attributing it to a deep-rooted sense of Orientalism. This term describes a perspective where Western analysts, locked in a Eurocentric view, see countries like Iran as inherently unstable or backward. Marandi argues that this bias leads Western experts to assume Iran's power is just smoke and mirrors, a mirage that will eventually collapse under pressure. But what we've seen is the opposite. Iran, far from crumbling, has maintained resilience and strength that keep proving these biases wrong.
But when Iran struck the Israeli regime weeks ago, then suddenly they forgot what they used to say in the past.
A prime example of this underestimation happened with the Russian economy. When the West imposed harsh sanctions on Russia, the expectation was that they'd bring the economy to its knees. Instead, Russia adapted and managed to weather the storm. The same pattern of misjudgment plays out with Iran, where sanctions and external pressures have been in place for decades. Yet Iran's economy and defense capabilities continue to stand strong, even thriving under conditions that Western experts claimed would break them. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.